All right, I've got to be honest with you guys. I'm having a hard time processing this one. Not because it's complex, but because I'm sitting here wondering how on earth we're just now hearing about it. After all the censorship, after years of the left screaming about the so called big lie, suddenly we're finding out that Fulton County, during the 2020 election, certified roughly 315,000 early votes that weren't legitimate. Let that sink in. After all the theatrics about misinformation, after silencing anyone who dared question the 2020 election, and yes, after that lovely Georgia indictment against President Trump, it turns out Trump may have been right all along. Georgia's election results were likely certified improperly. And once you pull on that thread, you start realizing it doesn't stop there. You could make a very real argument that Joe Biden's presidency itself rests on shaky ground, along with the Democrat Senate majority propped up by Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote. Naturally, the left-wing media is doing what it does best, pretending this story doesn't exist or brushing it off like it's some minor clerical error. You know, just a little oopsie involving one of the most consequential elections in modern American history. No big deal, right? And speaking of consequences, we all lived through 4 years of the Biden administration, and I think it's fair to say the results were less than stellar. But anyway, let's take a look at this latest bombshell, and I suppose we'll do the thing they told us we were never allowed to do. Yep, we're relitigating 2020. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's roll the tape. All right, folks, take a look at this.
I've not seen the tapes myself, but we do not dispute that the tapes were not signed. It was a violation of the rule. Since 2020, again, we have new leadership and a new building and a new board and new standard operating procedures. And since then, the training has been enhanced. The poll watchers are trained specifically. They've got to sign the tapes in the morning and they've got to sign the tapes when they're run at the end of the day. When the tapes come back to the hub for, with all the documentation, they are checked again. And if somebody forgot to sign a tape, then Fulton initiates an investigation. But we don't dispute the allegation.
All right, now I know if you just catch this clip out of context, it might sound a little confusing. So let's slow it down and translate this into plain English. Under Georgia law, poll workers at every early voting location are required to sign what are called tabulation tapes. That's what she means when she keeps mentioning the tapes. These are signed at the end of the day, and they're basically an official receipt that says, yes, this machine was run, yes, the totals were checked, and yes, this is the vote count we're certifying as accurate. Now here's where it gets fun. The Georgia Secretary of State's own investigation found that 36 out of 37 advanced voting precincts in Fulton County didn't sign those tapes. Most of them also failed to properly sign the zero tapes, which are supposed to prove the machines started at zero before any votes were counted. According to expert analysis, that little oversight impacted roughly 315,000 early votes. And yet, despite that glaring violation of election rules, Fulton County shrugged, carried on, and used those numbers in the official certification anyway. Which brings us to the obvious problem. By definition, those votes were never properly certified. That's not an opinion. That's based on their own rules and their own laws. Now, no, that doesn't automatically mean every one of those ballots was fake. But here's the part that really matters. Once you break the chain of custody and ignore your own certification process, there is no reliable way to go back later and verify anything. The safeguards are gone. Poof. Call me old-fashioned, but I don't think you get to violate election rules and then just certify the results anyway. And it somehow gets worse. Years later, they come back with a straight face and say, "Whoops, our mistake, we retrained our staff, so let's all just move on now." Just move on. Meanwhile, the margin of victory for Joe Biden in Georgia was under 12,000 votes. Under 12,000. And we're talking about over 300,000 early votes that blew past required procedures. But apparently, we're all supposed to nod along and pretend this is totally fine. No questions allowed. In fact, asking questions is now forbidden because the courts decided after a friendly left-wing judge rubber-stamped the whole thing. It's unbelievable. And this isn't some isolated oopsie that happened in a vacuum. You stack this on top of everything else we've seen in Georgia and across the country. We've covered this endlessly. We all remember the CCTV footage out of Fulton County where it looked an awful lot like the same ballot was scanned more than once. And somehow we're still being told not to notice.
17,152 votes counted without ballot images. You also know that for the first machine count, 20,713 ballots were counted with what I like to call receipts. In addition to proving that 3,930 ballots were scanned and counted. And I sure hope that Miss Charlene McGowan is listening. Miss McGowan, on May 7th, you and your team got up before the board and said, yeah, I think Mr. Rossi's right. These ballots were scanned twice, but we're not sure if they were counted twice. That is a lie.
That's just flat out false. We've also heard directly from whistleblowers, and their accounts are on the record. Take this affidavit from Rosemary Parrish, a Cobb County hand recount monitor. She says that while reviewing absentee mail-in ballots up close, she noticed the ovals were perfectly printed. Not worn, not smudged, not inconsistent. Perfect. The ballots looked like they'd been copied straight off a printer. She thought it was odd at the time, but didn't realize it might be a serious issue until weeks later, when she watched a Senate hearing and heard another woman testify that she saw the same kind of pristine ballots being counted in Fulton County. During that hearing, a senator suggested these might have been duplicate ballots. Parrish made it clear that what she saw were not duplicates, because duplicates were handled in a separate room and tracked on the tally sheet she personally checked. So now you've got whistleblowers independently describing stacks of mail-in ballots that looked factory fresh, like they just rolled out of a copy machine. And this is on top of everything else we already saw. The bizarre late-night ballot counting, allegations of ballots being scanned more than once, the CCTV footage, and now this gets added to the pile. Yeah, forgive me if I'm not buying the nothing to see here routine. Something clearly wasn't right. And honestly, the part that still infuriates me the most is not just that all this shady nonsense was happening, but that we weren't even allowed to talk about it. In the United States of America, you had big tech, the mainstream media, and the Democrat political machine all working together to effectively outlaw skepticism. You didn't even have to make a claim. You could simply suggest that mass mail-in voting, last-minute rule changes, potential illegal ballot harvesting, or mysterious midnight ballot dumps deserve scrutiny, and suddenly you were branded an election denier. Not just wrong, but dangerous, someone who needed to be silenced. There was no transparency. There were no real audits, no matter how often the left insists otherwise. What we actually got were a handful of partisan judges rubber stamping some of the sketchiest election certifications in modern American history. That's it. Shut up, accept it, or get destroyed. It's disgusting. And at its core, it's deeply anti-American. And of course, this wasn't limited to Georgia. Democrats were running similar games across the most important swing states in the country.
Would you vote to certify, and will you vote to certify, the results of the 2024 election, no matter what they show?
Well, I voted not to certify the state of Pennsylvania because, as we saw in Pennsylvania and other states across the country, that there was unconstitutional acts circumventing the state legislature and unilaterally changing election law.
What about 2024? What about 2024?
We will see if this is a legal and valid election. What we're seeing so far is that Democrats are so desperate, they're trying to remove President Trump from the ballot. That is a suppression of the American people, and the Supreme Court is taking that case up in February. That should be a 9-0 to allow President Trump to appear on the ballot, because that's the American people's decision to make this November.
And the matter is, of course, halted pending that appeal, as you say. But just to be very clear, I don't hear you committed to certifying the election results. Will you only commit to certify the results if
they're
President Trump wins?
It means if they are constitutional. What we saw in 2020 was unconstitutional circumventing of the Constitution, not going through state legislatures when it comes to changing election law. And we're seeing this in my home state of New York, Kristen. We are seeing Democrats try to steal the election and illegally gerrymander congressional districts that we fairly won and are fair line. So I see this at a very local level, as well as the unconstitutional overreach we saw at the national level in 2020.
I want to move on to the university presidents, but just to put a fine point on this, Mr. Trump, his allies did take their case, their concerns about the election to court more than 60 times. They lost every time. Mr. Trump hired 2 independent firms to investigate that. They came up short, as well as the federal agency responsible for overseeing election security, CISA, said that the 2020 election was the most secure.
Ah, yes, nothing to see here, just casually cutting the state legislature out of the process, unconstitutionally rewriting election laws months before voting even started. Totally normal stuff. And if you dared point that out at the time, congratulations, you were immediately slapped with the misinformation label and told to shut up because 2020 was, according to the experts, the cleanest and most secure election in the history of humanity. Settled science. Case closed. Fast forward 5 years, and here we are. An official hearing. Georgia officials openly admitting, yeah, we broke the rules in the single most important county in the closest swing state in the country. And here's the kicker. If the rules had actually been followed, Donald Trump would have won Georgia. And if Trump won Georgia, he won the 2020 election. And let's not forget, Democrats also magically won Senate races in Georgia, which is wild because if what we're seeing now holds up, it completely detonates the fairy tale of 2020 being the most secure election ever conducted. That story collapses. 315,000 illegitimate votes. And that's just from one blatant procedural violation. That doesn't even touch all the other sketchy nonsense we've covered. If those votes are illegitimate, then the entire 2020 election gets flipped on its head. They keep telling us Joe Biden won fair and square, but what this actually looks like is Joe Biden being an illegitimate president. A razor-thin Democrat Senate majority? Illegitimate. Judges rammed through? Illegitimate. The weaponized DOJ? The open border disaster? Runaway inflation? None of it should have happened. The entire agenda may be illegitimate from top to bottom. And we're not even opening the AutoPen can of worms yet, which somehow started on day one. It's insane. And once again, it proves Democrats aren't interested in winning elections the right way. They prefer to force outcomes, bend the rules, and then censor anyone who dares ask a question. Show even a shred of intellectual curiosity, and suddenly you're a fascist. The 2020 election looks completely contaminated. And this is just more evidence stacking up on the pile. Anyway, that's what I've got for you today. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video so it doesn't magically disappear. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the